And good afternoon and welcome to this World Oregon webinar. We are thrilled to have you join us today. We'll be getting to the program in just a minute with our guest, Bonnie Glick, who's going to talk about caring for the world, the future of U.S. foreign assistance. First, a few words of welcome and housekeeping announcements. For those of you who've been to our webinars before, it's familiar. For those of you who haven't, including we might have some folks joining us from around the U.S. through the World Affairs Councils of America Network and the Global Ties US Network. We welcome you, and this might be new for you. So just a few housekeeping points. I think by now, most of you are all pretty familiar with Zoom. Just a reminder, this is a Zoom webinar where everyone's video and audio is off except for our guest speaker and World Oregon staff. However, you can pose as many questions as you would like in the Q&A function on your screen. Tim DeRoche, the program director, will moderate those questions later in the program with Bonnie. We will from time to time post items in the chat, either a reminder to post questions or maybe links for different reports or things that get mentioned during the discussion. So encourage you to also monitor the chat, and you can click on those links, which should open up in your browser. Again, attendance at these webinars is free for World Oregon members. If you're not yet a World Oregon member, we would highly encourage you to do so through our website, worldoregon.org. where we're also in the midst of an end of year giving campaign. So we thank you for your consideration either directly or through the Willamette Week Give Guide. This program will be recorded for posting later on YouTube, so mind your P's and Q's. And we always get a robust audience afterwards, and then it can be shared out for friends and colleagues who aren't able to join us. This is the last major webinar that we're having before we're going to be taking a little bit of a break for the holidays. However, we have, at the end of the program, I'll mention some of our upcoming programs. And we also always have a great deal of programming through our sister member organizations through the World Affairs Councils of America Network. And now to today's program. We're going to talk about the future of U.S. foreign assistance, and specifically through U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID as it's known by its acronym. And we're thrilled to have Ms. Bonnie Glick speaking with us today. She is the former Deputy Administrator of USAID until recently, and is now a Senior Advisor at the noted Washington, D.C. think tank, Center for Strategic International Studies. Bonnie and I have known each other for many years. We actually overlapped as Foreign Service officers in the State Department back in the day, and we pieced this together. I think we were on phone calls and emails in different parts of the world more times than we care to remember when we were working on in the Operations Center and the line working on Secretary of State Albright's travels and work. So it's a real honor to have her back. She has also really worked closely with World Oregon when she was a senior leader at Meridian International Center, which does a ton of work on international visitors with the State Department. We were just talking about a soggy Timbers game that she came out and was here as part with some guests that we had from Latin America. And really, she has a whole host of experience on international visitors as well. So if that's a topic that interests you, when we get to the Q&A, we can jump into that. As I mentioned, just a little bit more on her bio. In addition to working as the Chief Deputy Administrator and COO of USAID from January 2019 to November 2020, and her 12 years of Foreign Service Officer experience in the State Department, she's also worked for IBM as a Global Account Executive, including in the Research Division. She's worked for the Maryland Department of Aging as a Deputy Secretary of that department under Governor Larry Hogan. And as I mentioned, Meridian International Center, one of the noted nonprofit organizations in Washington, D.C. In her role as Deputy Administrator and COO of USAID, her portfolio included all of the agency's programs worldwide, which is 100 plus countries. Many of those are ones that Bonnie and I served in as Foreign Service officers, where we worked on a whole range of issues, including for me personally on democratization and the rule of law. And the issues that she championed in her time at the department, for USAID, were the significance of 5G as a development priority in emerging markets, private sector engagement, democracy and governance, as I mentioned, global vaccine distribution, of course, key now, the Abraham Accords and food security. And she was the executive sponsor of USAID's COVID-19 task force that addressed both the safety and security of the global workforce and the international response to the outbreak, which of course has been the galvanizing issue of this year. So a very experienced, knowledgeable, and really warm person. It is wonderful for us to be able to host Ms. Bonnie Glick. Bonnie, the floor is yours.
Derek, thank you so much for having me here today. And I love the work that you do. I'm so happy that even in these uncertain COVID times, we're still able to invite the world to Oregon and to keep Oregonians plugged in as well to what's going on in the world. And on a personal level, for me, as you said, I'm happy to be back in Oregon after spending time with you and World Oregon just a few years ago. As you pointed out, I was the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development for the past 2 years. And during that time, we've seen an awful lot going on in the world, not least of which has been the global pandemic of COVID-19. As a result of COVID, of course, all of our worlds have migrated. In some ways, our worlds have become smaller. We're all more limited in terms of what we can do, where we can go, who we can see in person. But at the same time, I like to see the glasses half full, and our worlds have actually expanded and grown. We're now able to communicate with old friends and new friends around the world on a regular basis. So thank you for inviting me to come here today to meet with some new friends. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we in the United States are able to do around the world in the context of COVID and how important U.S. leadership is, both today and into the transition into the Biden administration in the future. Part of that discussion will focus on the historic role that the United States plays as the largest ever bilateral donor of foreign assistance. So I'll start my remarks with some observations about development globally and the context of the work at USAID. And then maybe I'll focus more squarely on some examples about what we're doing around the world, particularly as it relates to global health, since that's such a priority issue for all of us today. So let me begin by making the point that is often overlooked. Foreign assistance is not just a numbers game. It's not just who has written the most checks and for how much and to whom. Foreign assistance is a reflection of a nation's core principles and values. America's use of smart, soft power has always been a reflection of our values from our moment of independence. And in fact, you could even argue that the most powerful and important assistance tool we've given the world is our Declaration of Independence. There, for all to read, are the principles that America has always stood for: the dignity of the human person, inalienable rights of individual citizens, the expectation of transparency and governance, and the demand for accountability from our elected leaders. There's ample evidence of our commitment to these principles over the years, including the Marshall Plan, the Peace Corps, USAID itself, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. When you think about it, though, in terms of health specifically, you can think about things like the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which we call PEPFAR, and the US President's Malaria Initiative. These are just among the few of our global commitments to healthcare around the world. And all of these assistance programs reflect America's values and America's commitment to free markets and free people. Our foreign assistance has always been designed to promote national sovereignty, prosperity, democratic governance, accountability to the citizenry, and individual rights. One of the things that I was proud to champion at USAID was successful development results in stable and sustainable societies for the long term. It's what we refer to as a journey to self-reliance. And America has been a partner to countries around the world along their journeys towards self-reliance. Three of the great examples that I like to point out when discussing self-reliance are Israel, South Korea, and India. All three countries used to receive foreign assistance, and now all three are donor countries themselves. We partner with them and other donors around the world, and it's a source of great pride for us when we're able to partner and co-finance projects and programs with countries that have earned their own places as world leaders. America has been the largest provider of health assistance worldwide for decades, contributing more than $140 billion in global health assistance just in the 21st century alone. In response to COVID-19, we have engaged in what we refer to as an all of America effort. It includes all parts of American society, from government to NGOs and charities to the private sector. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, the US government has contributed nearly $2 billion, specifically aimed at fighting the pandemic abroad in over 120 different countries. But that number doesn't reflect the generosity of private businesses, nonprofit groups, charities, faith-based organizations, and individuals, nor does it represent the ingenuity of our scientists, researchers, and innovators. We currently have 3 vaccines that are ready, we hope soon, for global distribution, and I have no doubt that there are several more vaccines in the pipeline that will be announced and available soon. American ingenuity and invention are driven by challenges like this vexing virus, and we as a society rise to those challenges. Together, businesses and organizations have provided over $4 billion in donations and assistance to combat COVID-19, and this accounts for nearly 80% of global philanthropic efforts. In Africa, as an example, our US government assistance includes around $400 million to 43 different countries. Our immediate response in Africa aims to meet the critical needs of communities, governments, and of course, the health workers on the front lines of the pandemic. Specifically, we're improving coordination within health systems, making sure communities understand the risks of contracting the virus, and strengthening the capacity to detect and monitor any health issues that might arise as a result of COVID-19. Even while we in the United States are still deep in the throes of this pandemic, and obviously we're all still grappling with trying to control the disease here, some people ask why it's important for the United States to be helping other countries. And now, obviously, the United States has always been a generous nation, and we do well to help others whenever we can. But beyond that, why is it important now to be investing in this? Well, for over 60 years, the United States has invested in developing countries, invested in helping those countries travel along their journeys to self-reliance, and in particular, invested in health systems in those countries. In Africa in particular, beginning at the start of the 21st century, we started a program under President George W. Bush called the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Some of you may remember a time when AIDS was ravaging the African continent while also impacting us tremendously here in the United States. President Bush knew at the time, and it's proving to be the case today, that if there's a disease anywhere, there's a disease everywhere. And so we couldn't effectively respond to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States without also addressing the countries around the world where AIDS was raging and people were dying. So he set up a very visionary program to help save what has now been dozens of millions of people's lives around the world, particularly but not exclusively concentrating in Africa through the PEPFAR program. And through this program, we have established in over 50 countries around the world health systems for tracking disease, for treating disease, as well as for providing treatments down to what President Bush had in mind, which was down to the village level, the last mile. We've created through the PEPFAR program and programs that have followed since from the United States, one of the most sophisticated delivery systems of supply chains in the world. And it's something at USAID and across the government that we've been particularly proud of. So the United States is investing now in funding that's going to be directed toward the COVID response, but it's able to leverage off of existing platforms that were built out over the years, whether they were related to AIDS or malaria or tuberculosis or SARS or Ebola around the world. And this has proven the benefit of those investments that were made over 20 years ago, as I said earlier, $140 billion in the last 20 years in global health programs alone. Those investments will pay off if we're able to contain the COVID-19 virus and treat patients through the systems that we've built up around the world. And so I take the point that this was an investment, and it does go very much to the issue of the pandemic in one country means that it'll be a pandemic in the United States. The world is interconnected now more than it ever has been, and we won't be safe at home if people aren't safe abroad. So the PEPFAR example, I think, is a fascinating one because it is a very clear distillation of how the United States approaches development assistance and how it's not just about spending some amount of money, but really trying to help countries achieve self-reliance. We give assistance as a donor nation, but we do it with an eye toward investing in a developing country's future, in its self-reliance. Now, other powerful nations have their own values and their own principles. So we shouldn't be surprised to be confronted by approaches that are different from our own, which brings me to the example of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP's foreign assistance program reflects the party's principles and values, and it starts with the fact that its assistance program has nothing to do with development. And instead, it has everything to do with intimidation, influence, resources, and power. We're seeing this most clearly on the African continent. The PRC's assistance programs do not aim to liberate nations from subsistence, from debt, and from foreign influence, but rather to make them more dependent on the Chinese Communist Party, CCP capital, CCP corporations, even CCP labor and CCP strength. This is a battle of ideas. And the Chinese Communist Party's big idea is that its system of state authoritarianism and state capitalism is better positioned to lead the way in fighting the pandemic on a global stage. We believe our approach to assistance stands in stark contrast to the model put forward by Beijing. Beijing promotes a journey to dependence on China, while the United States of America offers a journey to self-reliance, and we have the record to prove that we have the better case. America has always been the leader in development, global health, and humanitarian assistance. We're continuing that tradition, that leading role in the global response to COVID-19, and will lead the world in recovering from the pandemic and in the second and third order effects of that pandemic. We're faced today with what people refer to as a great power competition. But I take some issue with that terminology. A competition implies that we're playing the same game and that we're playing by the same set of rules. In fact, we're playing on different playing fields entirely, and those fields are based on values. The American field represents the values of free societies and free markets, of accountability to citizens. The Chinese Communist Party's playing field represents authoritarianism, state capitalism, and repression of citizens, particularly those who represent ethnicities or ideologies that do not align with Beijing's. Now look, I want to save time for conversation and questions, Derek. So I'll close by saying that as we transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, there are certain things that will change, but a lot of things will remain the same. When we look at the landscape of foreign assistance, we'll be facing some of the same challenges under President-elect Biden as we've faced under President Trump, predominantly a raging coronavirus and the after impacts of that around the world, and a competition with the People's Republic of China, with Russia, and with other malign actors around the world. The great thing about American development assistance is that over the past 60 years, it has received enormous bipartisan support. The concept of global assistance is viewed by most Americans as part of our values system. It's what we do as Americans. It's in our DNA as a nation. I don't think that'll change. I know that under a Biden administration, as under the Trump administration, we're going to look to our partners in donor countries around the world to join with us as we address the development and humanitarian challenges of the day. The great news for the incoming administration is that over the past 4 years, we've built new and stronger donor relationships. We've brought new donors into the fold. We've expanded the table of donors to include countries like India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and so many others. So while it's important to continue working with the long-standing donors like the EU, Japan, Australia, and others, it's critically important to be welcoming of new donors. I saw this very clearly when I was working with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, to prepare for their donor conference, which occurs every 4 years. Even in advance of COVID, Gavi was looking to new sources of funding to help ensure that poor countries around the world have access to childhood vaccinations. And we called new donors, new partners to help ensure the health of children in countries with whom they had no previous relationship. And we bridged those divides. I have no doubt that these types of coordination and collaboration will continue and they'll expand. And I look forward to helping the incoming team in any way that I can. That too, Derek, is one of the great things about our democracy. We preach good governance and democracy around the world as one of the core tenets of USAID. And I look forward to demonstrating that same type of peaceful transition activity as new political leaders come to Washington to run USAID and other national security agencies. As we've seen coming out of our recent elections, democracy isn't perfect. Our own democracy is imperfect. But the good news is that while there is room for improvement, we as citizens actively seek out that room, and we actively seek out that improvement. So with that, Derek, Tim, I'll close. I'd like to wish everyone good health and great joy as we head into the holiday season and into 2021. So Tim, I think you had a few questions come up, and I'm happy to focus on those.
Thank you so very much, Bonnie. This is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs, World Oregon. Glad you could all join us today. Let us jump right in. Tom DeMeo, our dear friend Tom DeMeo, member, former Peace Corps worker, wants to know, do you think the new administration will join the COVAX initiative for international COVID vaccination?
So, Tom, that's a great question. I don't have a crystal ball. For those of you who are listening and aren't familiar with the COVAX facility that's being facilitated by Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, the idea there is for countries to sign up to be part of a global partnership for vaccine distribution. And over 100 countries have signed up to be part of the COVAX facility. The United States has not yet signed up. I don't know whether or not the Biden administration will make the determination that that's the right thing to do. There are pros and cons with the United States joining. And it's really going to be a balance of, does it make sense to join from our national perspective as we're rolling out vaccinations and we want to see the population in the United States vaccinated, or does it make sense immediately to jump into the global effort on vaccinations? I am a personal believer that it's important that vaccines be distributed as widely and as rapidly as possible around the world. And so my own personal view is the one that I'm able to share with the incoming Biden administration.
So you mentioned the Biden administration. Is there any word on the street of who might be the USAID administrator that is picked to work with Blinken?
There are a lot of words on the street. Again, going back to that default that I don't have a crystal ball, all of the names that I've heard floated are totally credible and confirmable, which is really a key, confirmable by the Senate. As I noted earlier, USAID has such bipartisan support on the Hill. Senator Merkley, I remember meeting with him, one of your great senators from Oregon, when I was in my consultation period for confirmation. And while he had very little good to say about the policies of the Trump administration, one of the things that we agreed on was the critical importance of foreign assistance and the U.S. role as a leader in that space. And so the names that I have heard floated are all people who are highly credible, highly experienced, have deep understanding both of international relations as well as of the needs in development. So I'm hopeful for whoever it is who's named, they'll have a great partner in the Secretary-designate Tony Blinken.
So what kind of a future with the Millennium Challenge Corporation do you see in terms of partnership with USAID in development?
Millennium Challenge Corporation is a critical tool in the national security toolbox as it relates to how the U.S. focuses on development abroad. And its role, I hope, will be elevated even further in the Biden administration. The MCC, as it's called, has a particular mandate to focus on funding large-scale infrastructure projects around the world in developing countries. But those large-scale infrastructure projects are only based on whether or not that particular country has hit all of the democracy criteria and all of the transparency criteria that are required to be eligible for an MCC Compact Award. And the reason that I think MCC can and should be even more important in the incoming administration is both the urgent need for infrastructure build out around the world, as well as the urgent need for the United States to be represented as a counter to the People's Republic of China and the efforts that China is undertaking to finance as much as possible, particularly in Africa, of large-scale infrastructure rollouts. And that's not due to any kind of altruistic vision that the People's Republic of China has. Rather, it's to do one of two things, or two of two things. One is to lead a developing country into greater indebtedness, and indebtedness specifically to the PRC, so that Chinese officials can have an outweighed sense of importance in the management of that country's both internal and external affairs. The other component of it is that infrastructure is going to be so important, particularly in areas like the rollout of 5G. And we've all become so much more dependent on technology and on devices for living and interacting with people all over the world. And so 5G, the next generation, the fifth generation of broadband connectivity, is going to be an enormous boon to economies, but it also potentially, if placed in the wrong hands, can be a boon to human rights violators. And the technology of 5G can be used for surveillance. It can be used even more so for facial and walking pattern recognition. And these are tools that have been honed and developed by authoritarian governments and authoritarian regimes, and knowing that those might be rolled out through large-scale infrastructure build-outs in emerging market countries gives me a bit of discomfort. So MCC, if it can play a role in those 5G rollouts around the world, I think that'll be critically important as well.
So, of course, COVID-19 is front and center on all of our minds. We've got a question here about the World Health Organization, but I think it brings up the larger question of, we have seen the country retreating from multilateral agreements and associations and alliances like, the WHO, the WTO, the Paris Climate Accord. How long do you think it will take the Biden administration to fully re-engage with, say, the World Health Organization or some of these other very important international alliances?
So let me talk specifically about the World Health Organization and give a little bit of background as to why the United States withdrew its membership. First, I'll answer your question. I think that the Biden administration, one of its top priorities will be to re-engage in organizations like the WHO. That said, a little bit of background for people who are here today is that the World Health Organization has not been well run for the last handful of years at least. Let's go back in time a little bit to the first Ebola outbreak that hit the news in West Africa, when Ebola was a real problem facing Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And the stewardship of that the response by the World Health Organization was, I could charitably refer to as clumsy. But let's move forward a couple of years to the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the rollout of the WHO's response to that Ebola outbreak was not just clumsy, but smacked of corruption. And we at USAID, as well as within the interagency, the State Department, Health and Human Services, CDC, the White House, we were struggling with, is now the time to pull out of the WHO because the management of health crises is not being done well. It's not being done in a manner that allows us to say that we're being good stewards of US contributions, and we were the largest contributor to WHO. And At the time, we said, no, it doesn't make sense to pull out now because we're in the middle of this Ebola outbreak, and the danger is that it'll spread to countries across its borders, and then it's unleashed on the world. So we didn't pull out of WHO. Fast forward just a few months and we have the COVID crisis. And the determination was made that now would be the time to pull out of WHO. Kind of like we've had it already. The leadership is not attuned to where the problems genuinely lie with WHO. And the result of this is that this virus has escaped from China and it's been unleashed on the rest of the world. And look where we are today, a year later, with people dying, and the numbers not decreasing. The numbers are only increasing. And now some people call this the second wave. Some say it's actually a third wave. So is there ever a right time to make a bold strategic move that would have these kinds of global implications? It's hard to say when the right time is, Tim, but this was a moment that captured the world's attention. And if we were going to make a statement about the WHO, there was no better time, we decided, than in the middle of the pandemic.
So at World Oregon over the years, we've seen, with our international visitor program, for instance, we've seen where the priorities of investment are around diplomacy. Certainly, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of investment in democratization projects from post-Soviet countries. After 9/11, a lot of Middle Eastern diplomacy programs. Do you see any particular geographical area that will receive prioritization in funding by USAID going forward?
Yeah, I do. For USAID as an agency, traditionally Africa has received the most funding in terms of a percentage of the budget. And that historically has been about 40% of USAID's $20 billion budget has gone to the African continent. I do see that continuing. One of the great things that was an honor for me was to visit a number of countries around the world where USAID has a presence. And the first place I went was to Africa, where I visited 4 different countries. And I had done, as Derek mentioned, I was a foreign service officer when he was, so a long time ago. And I had served, for example, in the early 90s in Ethiopia. And at the time, Ethiopia was one of the poorest countries in the world. I left there and came back 26 years later. And boy, had things changed. And it went from a country of about 50 million people to a country of 100 million people. It went from it's not a democracy, or at least not a fully functioning democracy. And so some of the problems that were there in Ethiopia when it transitioned from a communist dictatorship to a country on the road to democracy, some of the problems are still there today. But the level of development and the level of construction was extraordinary, so much so that Addis Ababa, the capital, which used to be sort of a sleepy capital of 400,000 people, is now a booming megacity of 10 million people. So Africa will continue to be a focus, but because there's been so much growth and because there's so much recognized potential and so much entrepreneurial activity, under the Trump administration, we began a program called Prosper Africa. And Prosper Africa is designed to focus assistance and cooperation, really, on what we called trade, not aid, and opening up new trade lanes that Americans are very interested in bilateral trade, bringing resources in from Africa and exporting resources from the United States to Africa. So I think that will continue, as will our traditional programs in global health, in education, and things like that, food security. But I also know that the Indo-Pacific region, which was a priority region for the Trump administration, will remain a priority region for the Biden administration. It's a part of the world that our allies are keenly focused on in terms of both the path toward democracy of Southeast Asian countries, of the Pacific Islands, but also in terms of the front lines in the efforts to contain a resource-hungry People's Republic of China. And so I would imagine there is no reason to lessen the focus on the Indo-Pacific region at USAID. There's no reason to lessen it on Africa. Other parts of the world have seen enormous successes over time. And when you look at the Western Hemisphere, you have great burgeoning economies. You have tremendous economic growth, which has been hampered by COVID. Same is true in parts of Europe and Eurasia, where USAID has a presence, and in the Middle East as well. So COVID has thrown a big monkey wrench into foreign assistance planning and how we'll roll out our foreign assistance. Countries that were on the verge of being self-reliant have been dealt a body blow, but it's not a death blow in any way, shape, or form. And the United States will continue to partner with countries to help them get back on track as they struggle with the impacts that were brought on by COVID.
So we've got a question from Global Ties Detroit. Welcome, Detroit. Glad to have you with us. They're part of the Global Ties US network, which World Oregon is a part of, very similar to the Meridian group, doing wonderful exchange programs. The question is there a greater role that US community organizations like those in the Global Ties Network can play in furthering the goals of USAID? And if so, how so, i.e. global health, civil society, economic development, et cetera?
So one of the things that's so amazing about international exchange programs, and you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, is that while we're bringing a touch of America, a touch of Detroit, a touch of Portland, a touch of Chicago, a touch of Phoenix to parts of the world, they're bringing touches of their countries to us and taking back the feeling of America to their countries while leaving us impacted by the relationships that we've developed with foreign visitors. And that's so critically important. USAID has traditionally had a very big field focus, which is a little bit different from the State Department, which runs the international exchange programs. Our focus is always in the USAID missions and outward from there. But I do know that a lot of the people who staff our missions are people who have done exchanges and a variety of different exchanges, whether cultural or educational exchanges here in the United States. So the need for exchanges for international visitors will remain. I think that that's in perpetuity. One of the things that USAID should maybe think about doing, especially in this virtual world, is finding ways to partner with the Global Ties Network, as well as university networks, to share experiences as well as to share science and research with comparable or partner communities and universities in other parts of the world. One of the great things that I saw when I was at USAID was how we partner with educational institutions, universities here and abroad to bring innovations to the marketplace. I'll give an example. I went to Kenya, and part of the program that was designed for me was to go to the arid region of northern Kenya and to meet with some farmers and tradespeople there, as well as to inaugurate a water project. And the water project was a particularly neat one. I was told in advance that it was a partnership with Coca-Cola and IBM. And I said, well, what was the partnership with IBM? I came from IBM. And they said, well, it's with IBM Research, which is the R&D arm of IBM. And I said, I came from IBM Research. What's the partnership? And the partnership was that IBM's Kenya Research Lab had partnered with this northern province in Kenya, as well as with Coca-Cola and some other companies, to find where would be the topographical, logical space to drill boreholes for water for the local community. And we were there to inaugurate this new borehole that had been established through mathematical modeling, geological modeling, and corporate sponsorship. So cool for a nerd like me. So I went there and met with IBM Research, who was an old colleague of mine from my time at IBM. One of the things that he told me, and he's an African research scientist, one of the things he told me that I thought was so neat was they took this technology that they developed for northern Kenya and then licensed that technology to the state of California, so that California would benefit from the research that had been conducted in Africa in an arid region that was similar to areas in California that needed access to this kind of technology. So whether it's through corporate or university relationships, I think that the time is right and the opportunities, particularly in this remote environment, are ripe for exchange across the board. People are hungry to learn more about what's going on in other parts of the world. So go for it, Detroit.
So we've got another vaccination question here, which I know is on all of our minds. Are American efforts to increase vaccinations around the world, not just for COVID-19, are they accompanied by public relations campaigns to convince people of the safety and the benefits of vaccinations?
Yes, that is a great question. One of the things that I often find puzzling here in the United States is why people are so opposed to vaccinations when they so clearly help to stem disease and protect children in particular, as well as those children's communities. We don't tend to run into so much backlash from, I guess, what here in the US is called the anti-vaxxer community abroad. We don't run into as much conflict as we do here in the United States when it comes to vaccinations. Maybe part of that is because a big component of our global health activity is in the area of what we call technical assistance, helping communities understand the critical value of what USAID is bringing to their communities, so that vaccination campaigns down to the village level, particularly for childhood vaccinations, are very, very well received. I'll give an example, though, of one where it was a little bit harder, and this goes to that Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because it's not all roses all the time, and development work is hard, and you're operating in complex and sometimes insecure environments. And that was certainly the case in the Democratic Republic of the Congo when there were some trial vaccines that were made available for countering the Ebola virus. And their trials, they were what are called these EUA vaccines, emergency use authorization vaccines that the US Federal Drug Administration determines can be used in an emergency. And so we had EUA, emergency use authorized vaccines available through a drug manufacturer and actually through 2 drug manufacturers. And we had a campaign that we had to mount to an otherwise relatively suspicious community in the very isolated parts of Eastern DRC to convince them that vaccinations would be healthful as well as helpful. And that was a large-scale undertaking, not always successful, but certainly when we do roll out vaccinations, there is a large component of this technical assistance that's focused on how do you vaccinate people and what are the values associated with vaccinating populations?
That's great. So, World Oregon we're an educational organization. We're a nonpartisan organization. And without getting into the partisan weeds, one of the things that we hear coming up often, Derek and I participated in our national conference a couple weeks ago, and we had people like Mark Grossman and Nick Burns, career diplomats, talking about, the sort of shakeup at the State Department, and if not a crisis, the opportunities for reforming diplomacy moving forward. And I'm kind of curious, as someone who has spent a lifetime in service, for young people who are interested in throwing themselves into service and serving their country, whether it's with career diplomacy, it's soft power, or pick your choose your adventure. What kind of advice would you have for young people going forward, and are you hopeful about the directions you see state and some of those very, very important institutions going forward?
So I'm the mother of those very young people that you're talking about who are on the cusp of making these important decisions, life-changing decisions oftentimes, about whether or not to enter service for your country in whatever form, whether it's in the military or the State Department, in development, in the Peace Corps, any number of options. And I always encourage young people to, for example, take the Foreign Service exam. It doesn't cost anything, and it's just worth getting a sense of what it takes to be considered for a career as an American diplomat. For me, as a young Foreign Service officer, there was no greater honor that I've had in my life to be able to represent my country to countries all over the world. And when I was a student in the United States, maybe I didn't always feel that sense of patriotism. But when you see the United States through the lens of other people's perspective on our country, I think we end up coming out looking pretty good. And one of the reasons that we come out looking good is because we can have vibrant and often uncomfortable conversations with each other, and no one ends up in jail. People may walk away with their feelings hurt if they disagree in a disagreeable manner. But the concept of being able to disagree agreeably is one not to be discounted, and to truly be valued. Young people have their whole careers ahead of them, and they have a time now in their lives when they can take risks that maybe when they get a little bit older, they can't take, whether it's because of family concerns or parental concerns or whatever it may be, professional It's always a great opportunity. You never lose by serving your country. And in the future, I think it is reflected well on an individual that they took time out to pursue a career option when there were multiple career options open and available to them. So I highly encourage service of your country.
Thanks a lot, Bonnie. I'm going to bring Derek back on screen to take us back out into our day. Thank you so much for an incredible talk, and it was a pleasure to have you. And Derek, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the audience for some great questions, both from here in the local community and throughout the U.S. through the Global Ties U.S. and World Affairs Councils of America networks. Bonnie, it was great to have you update us on what's going on. And, you know, as the vaccine starts to roll out, for those of you who saw in the UK today, it's, you know, it is an exciting time. We're hopeful that in 2021 we'll have, you know, increased international cooperation to work together on such a critical issue. Thanks again for your time and expertise. I really appreciate all that you had to share today.
Derek, it was a pleasure. Thank you all.
And just a few closing remarks. So reminders, I mentioned this is our last major webinar before the holidays. We'll encourage you to check out our YouTube channel where we have all the past programs we've done. And stay tuned because we will soon be announcing information for starting in January for the annual Great Decisions program that we do jointly with the Foreign Policy Association. You'll be able to purchase your Great Decision books directly from the Foreign Policy Association online. And Tim is working hard at curating a local series of talks to go with that. Also, just a reminder, as a nonprofit, end of year giving, if you can support ours or support the one in your community or another organization that is important to you to help in these challenging times. Thank you all for joining us. Bonnie, thanks again, and wishing everybody a safe and happy holidays.